Welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is The 1980s. So let's get into it. Now, if I was in a survey course, I would call this sort of the history of everything since I've been alive. But generally, for our purposes, we're going to talk about five terms that, as you read more about American sport and gaming in this period and you learn more about the time, that you can kind of get a sense of, for folks who were living at this time, what life was like and what are some of the things that are going on that it's important to be mindful of. So the first term for us is Reagan. All right. So if we're thinking about politics, Ronald Reagan looms large in an understanding of the 1980s for most people. So Ronald Reagan was elected president twice during this time period. Reagan had been someone who grew up in Illinois. Actually, in his very early days, was a lifeguard, and commented on that as a part of his, kind of formative early years. Was someone who was in athletics, someone who was after college got into radio and actually broadcast games. And is someone who was a film actor in Hollywood for a number of years before pivoting to politics and getting elected president for the Republican Party in 1980 and again in 1984. So his kind of arc and story, in many ways reflected aspects of American cultural life in the 1980s. In that, Reagan is someone who served in World War II. If you're living in the 80s, that's history, but it's not that far away. For those who are in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 40 years prior, was not necessarily that long, didn't feel that long ago. All right. So Ronald Reagan, right? Now, the second term for us is, of course, going to be the Cold War. Now, oftentimes, we will often think of the Cold War as kind of beginning or starting in late 1940s, early 1950s. In many ways, it's still very much alive and well in the 1980s for much of the decade, although the Soviet Union's collapse, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and all of this stuff, is pretty clear that the Soviet Union is on its decline in this period. But if you're living in America in the 1980s, aspects of American cultural life are deeply connected to this because, of course, you have any number of things from the miracle on ice with the Winter Olympics to other forms of sporting events and contests against the Soviet Union. But you also have, military conflicts and questions of foreign policy that are very real when it comes to nuclear weapons throughout the 1980s, when it comes to U.S. military incursions, throughout the 1980s. This very much is something. And even in popular culture in the 1980s, this is also very much the case, where you have, the Rambo series and others that are very much connected to Cold War conflicts like Vietnam. And so debates about that within American life, right, is very, very ever present. The other third phrase for us would be yuppies. So this is a phrase for young urban professional. So you have a rather pronounced consumer culture in the 1980s. Led by a number of individuals, where the view was, wearing the right suits, buying the newest tech, right? So by the time you get to the late 80s, you're seeing early versions of cell phones. You're seeing early versions of any number of technologies that are going to become more widely pronounced in the 1990s. The 80s is a time in which early computers are at home, are being introduced. The fourth term for us are going to be malls. So in the move to suburbs, you're going to see the transformation of consumer spaces and shopping spaces, and malls are going to become far more prominent as a part of daily life for many Americans across the United States. A fifth term for us is going to be the savings and loan scandal. Now, there were recessions and economic downturns in the 1980s. There was a savings and loan scandal that happens towards the end of the 80s where part of this has to do with how mortgages are going to be played out, and the government has to get involved and help to bail out savings and loans. And this particular incident, is similar in terms of what's going to happen eventually in like 2007, 2008, with the Great Recession. So, if not S&L scandals, certainly economic downturns are things that folks living in the 80s would very much have had to have been mindful of. Thank you very much.